In the rolling hills of Central California, where the sun once kissed endless rows of almond and walnut trees, something tragic happened in the early 2010s. A brutal, multi-year drought turned paradise into dust. Rivers ran dry. Wells dropped hundreds of feet. One by one, farmers who had worked this land for generations looked at their dying orchards and made the only decision that seemed rational. They sold their trees for scrap. Hundreds of acres of once thriving orchards were bulldozed, chopped down, and fed into wood chippers. The skeletons of what used to be family legacies were hauled away as firewood or mulch. Entire valleys that once smelled of blossoms in spring now looked like war zones, barren, cracked earth stretching for miles. Locals called it the Great Orchard Massacre. Banks foreclosed. Families moved away. The small towns that depended on the harvest began to wither. But while everyone else was cutting trees down and walking away, one man was doing the opposite. His name was Elias Hawthorne. Elias was 42 years old, a quiet, stubborn agronomist and former soil scientist who had spent 15 years working for big agricultural corporations. He wasn't flashy. He didn't chase trends. But he had spent years studying something most farmers had stopped believing in, the hidden life beneath the soil. While others saw dead trees, Elias saw something different. He had been quietly monitoring groundwater levels, soil microbiology, and ancient root systems across the Central Valley for years. What he discovered was shocking. Even after years of drought, deep beneath the surface, some of the oldest root networks were still alive, dormant, waiting. The trees weren't truly dead. They were in survival mode, a state botanists call drought-induced dormancy. With the right intervention, many could be revived. Most people laughed when he first mentioned his idea. Why would you buy dying trees when everyone else is desperate to get rid of them? They asked. Elias didn't argue. He simply started making offers. He drove from farm to farm in his old pickup truck, dressed in the same dark blue work shirt, brown leather jacket, dark jeans, and worn brown work boots. Farmers who had just signed contracts to bulldoze their orchards looked at him like he was crazy. Some felt pity. Others saw an easy payday. Elias bought entire orchards at scrap prices, sometimes for pennies on the dollar. In less than 6 months, he had acquired over 800 acres of what the locals now called the graveyard orchards. People in the nearby town of Ridgefield started whispering. That Hawthorne guy just bought a forest of dead sticks, they said. He's going to lose everything. But Elias wasn't gambling blindly. He had spent months mapping every single acre with soil probes, moisture sensors, and microbial tests. He knew exactly which blocks still had living root systems and which were truly beyond saving. He wasn't buying trees. He was buying hidden potential that nobody else could see. As the last of the healthy orchards in the valley were being harvested for the final time, Elias stood alone in the middle of his newly acquired land. The wind whipped dust across the barren rows. Twisted, leafless trunks stretched into the distance like silent tombstones. Most men would have seen failure. Elias saw the beginning of something extraordinary. He took a deep breath, knelt down, and pressed his hand into the dry, cracked earth. This isn't the end, he whispered to himself. This is just the pause. Little did the people of Ridgefield know that the man they were mocking had just made one of the boldest contrarian bets in modern American agriculture. A decision that would eventually transform not just these dying orchards, but the entire economy of a forgotten valley. The first year was brutal. Elias Hawthorne woke up every single day before sunrise in a small rented trailer parked at the edge of his 800-acre graveyard. The same dark blue work shirt, brown leather jacket, dark jeans, and brown work boots became his uniform. There were no employees yet, just him, a few old tractors he bought cheap, and an endless sea of skeletal trees. He started with the soil. While the rest of the valley had given up, Elias began the slow, painstaking work of bringing the earth back to life. He didn't flood the fields with expensive water he couldn't afford. Instead, he used a technique almost no one in commercial farming was talking about at the time: regenerative soil restoration combined with deep-root irrigation. He drilled hundreds of narrow, deep wells targeting the ancient aquifers that still held water far below the surface. Then he installed a network of underground drip lines that delivered water directly to the deepest living roots, not to the surface where it would evaporate in the California sun. It was slow. It was expensive. And for the first 6 months, almost nothing visible happened. The trees stayed bare. The wind still howled through the empty branches. Locals driving past on the county road would slow down, shake their heads, and keep going. "He's just pouring money into dirt," they said at the Ridgefield diner. "That man is going to go broke trying to raise ghosts." But Elias kept working. He brought in truckloads of compost made from the very wood chips of the orchards that had been destroyed nearby. He spread microbial inoculants, living bacteria and fungi that could rebuild the underground network trees need to survive. He planted cover crops between the rows, clover, vetch, and mustard that would pull nitrogen from the air and repair the damaged soil. Every evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, you could see his lone figure walking the rows, checking sensors, adjusting valves, talking quietly to the trees as if they could hear him. Then, in the second spring, something almost miraculous began. It started small. On a few dozen trees in the northern block, tiny green buds appeared, hesitant at first, then bolder. Elias stood in front of one of those trees for nearly an hour, just staring at the fragile new growth. For the first time in years, the orchard was showing signs of life. Word began to spread quietly. A few retired farmers started showing up on weekends, curious. They expected to see a disaster. Instead, they found Elias carefully pruning the dead branches, leaving the living wood intact. He explained his philosophy simply. These trees survived the worst drought in recorded history. They're not weak, they're the strongest ones. They just needed someone who still believed in them. By the end of the second year, over 60% of the trees had leafed out. The once barren landscape now had patches of green that grew larger every week. Elias was exhausted, his savings nearly gone, but the orchard was waking up. That's when the real challenge began. Water rights in California are complicated and fiercely contested. Big agricultural companies and neighboring farms watched Elias's experiment with growing interest and suspicion. Some saw opportunity, others saw competition. Suddenly, questions were raised about his water usage. Permits that should have been routine got delayed. Rumors spread that he was stealing water from deeper aquifers. Elias refused to play politics. Instead, he did something even more contrarian. He partnered with local environmental groups and installed solar-powered monitoring stations across the entire property. He published monthly reports showing exactly how much water he was using and how efficiently it was being delivered straight to the roots. Transparency became his defense. While others fought in courtrooms, Elias fought with data and results. As the third year arrived, the orchard looked completely different. Rows that had been lifeless sticks now carried heavy canopies of leaves. Almond and walnut trees that everyone had written off were producing small but healthy crops. The soil, once cracked and lifeless, had begun to soften. Earthworms, the ultimate sign of healthy soil, started appearing where none had been seen in a decade. Elias finally hired his first 3 workers, local men who had lost their jobs when the orchards died. He paid them fairly and taught them his methods. For the first time in years, there was the sound of laughter and conversation among the trees instead of silence. But success always brings new problems. The harvest that year was modest, yet it proved the concept. Elias sold his first almonds and walnuts at a local farmer's market. People were shocked at the quality. "These taste better than the ones from the big corporate farms," one buyer said. The flavor was richer, the nuts denser, as if the trees, having survived hell, were pouring everything into their fruit. Elias stood on a small hill overlooking his land as the sun set. The green sea stretched before him, swaying gently in the evening breeze. He had spent nearly everything he had. He had been mocked, doubted, and nearly broken. Yet the dying orchards were alive again. The question now was whether one man's stubborn vision could scale far enough to revive not just the trees, but the entire forgotten valley that depended on them. By the 4th year, the transformation was impossible to ignore. What locals once called the graveyard orchards had become a living, breathing miracle. Over 700 acres of almond and walnut trees stood tall and proud, their canopies thick with dark green leaves that shimmered under the California sun. The cracked, barren earth had given way to soft, rich soil teeming with life. Wildflowers bloomed between the rows. Birds that had long abandoned the valley returned in flocks. The air itself smelled different, sweet, alive, filled with the faint scent of blossoms and fertile ground. Elias Hawthorne, still wearing his signature dark blue work shirt, brown leather jacket, dark jeans, and brown work boots, walked the rows every morning like a proud father. The man who had once been mocked as a fool was now quietly becoming a legend. The economic ripple effects began slowly, then accelerated with breathtaking speed. First came the jobs. Elias expanded his small crew from 3 to 27 local workers, men and women who had been forced to leave Ridgefield for work in distant cities. He paid above-average wages and offered profit sharing. For the first time in over a decade, families were moving back into the small valley town. The dusty main street saw new life. The old hardware store reopened, the diner extended its hours, and the shuttered elementary school welcomed its first new students in years. Then came the buyers. Word of Elias's resurrection nuts spread far beyond California. Chefs in San Francisco and New York discovered that these trees, having survived extreme stress, produced nuts with deeper, more complex flavors. Premium organic brands and specialty food companies started placing large orders. Prices soared. What began as a modest harvest quickly grew into a highly profitable operation. In year 5, Elias cleared his first $1 million in profit, money he immediately reinvested into expanding the regenerative system. But Elias wasn't content with simply saving his own land. He launched what he called the Second Chance Orchard program. He offered his proven revival techniques to any former orchard owner willing to try. He provided free soil testing, shared his irrigation designs, and even helped secure low-interest loans for those who wanted to bring their own abandoned groves back to life. Some farmers who had sold their land to him years earlier came back, humbled, and asked to lease sections back under his guidance. The valley began to heal. New businesses sprouted. A small nut processing facility opened on the edge of town, creating even more jobs. A beekeeper moved in, placing hives throughout the orchards and producing award-winning honey. Agritourism started. Weekend visitors came to see the miracle orchards, stay at new bed and breakfasts, and learn about regenerative farming. Ridgefield, once a dying ghost town, was now being featured in agricultural magazines as a model for climate resilience. Of course, not everyone celebrated. Large corporate farms felt threatened by Elias's success. They lobbied for stricter water regulations and spread doubts about the long-term viability of his methods. A few skeptical journalists arrived with cameras, expecting to expose a fraud. Instead, they left impressed, filming documentaries about one man's quiet revolution against conventional industrial agriculture. Elias remained the same humble man throughout. He still lived in a modest house he built himself on the property. He still wore the same worn leather jacket and work boots. When reporters asked for interviews, he preferred to show them the trees rather than talk about himself. "I didn't create life here," he would say softly. "The trees were always fighting to survive. I just stopped the world from killing them." By year 7, the impact had become regional. Over 3,000 acres across the Central Valley had been revived using variations of Elias's techniques. Groundwater levels in the area began to stabilize. Local economies that had collapsed during the drought were experiencing a genuine renaissance. Young people who had left for college were returning home because there were now opportunities in sustainable agriculture. One crisp autumn morning, Elias stood on the same hill where he had once knelt in the dust years earlier. The valley stretched before him, a vast sea of healthy, productive trees swaying in the breeze. Harvest machines moved efficiently through the rows, while workers laughed and called to each other. In the distance, the rooftops of a revitalized Ridgefield glowed in the morning light. A young reporter approached him carefully. "Mr. Hawthorne, most people would have walked away like everyone else. Why did you buy every dying tree when no one else believed they could come back?" Elias looked out over his orchard, a quiet smile crossing his face. "Because someone had to remember that even when everything looks dead, life finds a way. These trees taught me that resilience isn't loud. It's patient. It waits underground, through the hardest times, until the right conditions return. All they needed was one person crazy enough to believe in them." He paused, then added with a gentle laugh, "And maybe, just maybe, I needed them as much as they needed me." As the camera pulled back in a sweeping aerial shot, the full scale of the transformation became clear. What was once a landscape of despair had become a beacon of hope, proof that one contrarian decision, rooted in deep knowledge and stubborn faith, could revive not just an orchard, but an entire community and way of life. Elias Hawthorne never set out to become famous. He simply refused to accept that something beautiful was permanently lost. He bought the dying trees when everyone else sold them for scrap. And in doing so, he didn't just save an orchard. He saved a valley. He saved families. He saved a future that almost disappeared. And somewhere, deep beneath the rich soil, those ancient roots continue their quiet, powerful work, reminding anyone willing to listen that the greatest comebacks often begin when everyone else has given up.